Thank you very much indeed, Mark, and a very warm welcome to everybody, wherever you are. I won't say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, because we're all in different time zones. It's a very great pleasure this afternoon to, and I've just said it, haven't I, to welcome Neil Donen, Fellow of the Royal Philatelic Society, to present his display of the Sir Charles Kingsford-Smith's ill-fated 1935 Trans-Tasman Jubilee flight. This is going to be an excellent afternoon, and without any further comment from me at this stage, Neil, it's over to you for your presentation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Richard. So the first thing I just want to make sure is if everyone can see my talk. Mark, is it visible?
Not yet, because you're not sharing your screen with us yet.
Aha. All right, let's go. How's that look?
Perfect.
Great. So good morning, everyone, from Victoria, which is on the Canadian West Coast. And I'd just like to start off by first acknowledging and thanking Mark for his input, support, and assistance in helping me make this presentation work. It really is much appreciated. At the same time, I'd also like to thank Richard and Mike. So my presentation is going to be covering a largely forgotten story. It'll include, in addition to the usual presentation on rates and routes, a story of what I consider to be one of incredible bravery in one of the most dramatic events that occurred in the history of air philately. There were many exciting firsts for me when I started working on this particular topic, and I've identified, as you will see, a number of philatelic firsts, and more recently the uncovering of the process of delivery of saved mail to New Zealand. In addition to this, there were a few rather unexpected findings. So as you can see, my presentation will cover 6 broad sections. So the story really begins in 1933, when the British government approved in principle the idea of an All-Empire Airmail Scheme, which was to be managed by Imperial Airways. And by 1934, the leg between Singapore and Australia had been completed, and this was achieved in partnership with Qantas Airlines. And in January of 1935, discussions began on the Australia-New Zealand leg. Charles Kingsford-Smith, who is a central character obviously in the story, had lost the contract on the Singapore-Australia leg and was hoping to actually obtain the contract for the last leg. And to this extent, he then proposed to both governments a special Trans-Tasman flight, which had a bit of a rocky beginning. He made his application on the 6th of April, was rejected initially on 2 occasions, but for whatever reason, and I cannot find the reason why, there was a sudden change, and on the 28th of April in New Zealand and on the 29th in Australia, it was announced that the Trans-Tasman flight would occur. Can you all see the pictures of the rates? Just want to make sure you can.
Yes.
So I'm going to be covering many of these rates in the talks. I will not focus on them on this particular slide, but I will draw to your attention the top 3 slides, the most important of which being the airmail route one way each way of 7p or 14 pennies, 1 shilling and 2p, and the return surface mail rates from New Zealand to Australia, which was a penny, and from Australia to New Zealand, which was 2p. In order to get the maximum amount of publicity and also to encourage people to participate in the Jubilee flight, Kingsford-Smith designed and distributed free souvenir covers, both in Australia and New Zealand. And there are some differences between these covers, which you will see popping up throughout the presentation. The Australian covers were lightweight. They came in 3 colors of white, blue, and old gold. The New Zealand covers were somewhat larger and heavier, and all were cream colored but had either a chocolate or a blue script. The New Zealand Post Office obviously realized this was a great opportunity and designed their own commemorative cover as well, because this would be, in fact, the first airmail flight between New Zealand and England. So these are the three covers which you will see appearing regularly throughout the presentation. Interesting enough, at about this time, there were 4 issues of stamps that happened. The first was on the 1st of May, which was the New Zealand pictorial stamps. The next day, the 2nd, Australia issued its 1935 Silver Jubilee. On the 4th of May, New Zealand issued its airmail stamps. And finally, on the 7th of May, New Zealand also issued its 1935 Silver Jubilee stamps. And again, these stamps will appear commonly on all of the covers. I'm going to focus really on the New Zealand airmail stamps because they are important from a philatelic perspective. This was really the first occasion that New Zealand had made arrangements with a foreign company to have their stamps sold at a foreign post office. And this joint agreement took place with the issue of these stamps on the 4th of May, where some 75,000 stamps were sent from New Zealand. They left there on the 1st of May, arriving in Australia on the 4th of May. And they were on sale on most of the state capitals except Perth. In addition, they were on sale in Launceston, which is in Tasmania, and at the various New Zealand tourist bureaus. I've provided you some details regarding the design of these particular stamps. The only point I really wish to make is that at the bottom, this drawing here is of Bell Block Airfield, which is New Plymouth. And this was the site that had been chosen by the New Zealand government for the international airport. And that is the place to which Kingsford-Smith was hoping to fly. We need to talk a little bit about the plane and the people. The Southern Cross is probably the most famous plane in Australian aviation history. It was purchased by Kingsford-Smith and Charles Kingsford in 1927. And in 1928, it gained international fame by being the first plane to cross the Pacific rather, it's taking about 10 days. In addition to and Smith, there were 2 Americans who tend to be forgotten, but certainly they were present there. Harry Lyon, who was the navigator, and Jim Hawthorne, who was the wireless operator. This plane subsequently was involved in a number of international firsts, including around the world. And in September of 1928, it also took the first flight between Australia and New Zealand. So this planned flight in May of 1935 would have been its 7th crossing of the Tasman Sea. 3 crew members are equally interesting. Both Kingsford-Smith and Patrick Gordon-Taylor, or as he liked to be called, Bill Taylor, had both been awarded military crosses during World War I, and both were in fact knighted for their services to aviation. Kingsford-Smith in 1932 and Taylor in 1954. Bob Stanage, who was the wireless operator, had been flying with Kingsford-Smith since 1930, and in fact, as a small minor footnote, was actually married to Kingsford-Smith's niece. So the proposed flight was a 2-way flight leaving on May 14th from Richmond Air Force Base, which is just north of Sydney. And the reason that Richmond Air Force Base was chosen because it had a longer runway, and it was to fly from Richmond to New Plymouth, which is in New Zealand. And the return trip was planned for the 17th of May, leaving from 99 Mile Beach, just north of Auckland, back to Mascot Airport, which is the international airport in Sydney. Obviously, with all the advertising, there was a fair amount of mail, and arrangements were made also for New Zealanders to have mail sent to Australia so it could be flown from Australia to New Zealand. And that mail was sent across, left New Zealand on the 9th and arrived in Australia on the 12th of May. As I'd indicated, the initial departure date was the 14th, but was delayed a day because of inclement weather. And during this time, an additional 7 bags were added, bringing the total number of mail items that were to be flown at 28,279. Another issue that did occur at this time was that there was supposed to be 2 planes flying. One was the Southern Cross, and the second was a plane known as the Faith of it in Australia, an equally famous plane. However, Kingsford-Smith's navigator became ill and he could not find a replacement. And because the amount of mail and the amount of freight that was to be carried was less than expected, they decided to fly in just the Southern Cross. And Taylor, who you can see over here, who was supposed to be the pilot of the second plane, now became Kingsford-Smith's navigator and co-pilot. So for these 28,279 mail items, Kingsford-Smith was paid the grand sum of 4p per mail item carried. That amounted to about £471 in 1935 currency. Today, that's about £35,000. So the crew departed just after midnight from Sydney, and everything appeared to be going quite well till about 7 in the morning, when a piece of the engine cowling broke off, splintering the starboard propeller, forcing that engine to be shut down. At that time, Smith made a decision to turn around and return to Australia, and they jettisoned most of the freight. He was hoping to save the mail. However, with ongoing problems, particularly of the port engine, which was beginning to overheat, they made a decision at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon to jettison the mail. Despite this, there was continued rising in the temperature of the port engine, and at this stage, Taylor took matters into his own hands. Basically, what he did was he climbed out of the cockpit onto the wing struts to the starboard engine, drained the oil from that engine and transferred it to the port engine. I do have a short little movie I'm going to show you. This is taken from a movie called Smithy, which was made in 1946, where this dramatic episode was recreated, and both Taylor and Stanage play themselves in this movie. So here it is.
Calmly, Taylor worked out a solution. He decided to climb up to the useless starboard engine, somehow get oil from its tank, and then climb over to the other side and transfer it to the tank of the failing port engine. As the Southern Cross struggled back to the Australian coast, he made the crossing back and forth between the outer engines, using a thermos flask to transfer the oil.
So for this incredible act of bravery, Taylor was awarded the Empire Gallantry Medal, which today we know as the George Cross. Obviously, this was very effective in reducing the temperature of the port engine, and they arrived safely in Sydney at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And after the crew had deplaned, they found that there were 7 mail bags which had been left behind, which Stanage, who had thrown the other mail out, had missed. They were all tucked into various crevices. And we are going to really focus on those 1,100 mail items from those mail bags in the next couple of slides. So this table here shows a breakdown of the total mail and the mail saved. I just draw to your attention on the right-hand side here in blue, these are the 7 mail bags that were covered. And as you can see, the largest amount came from Brisbane. The Sydney mail bag was the largest, but also contained the 7,000 odd mail items that had been sent by ship from New Zealand to be carried back by air. So all the New Zealand mail was lost. In addition to that, mail from Perth and Hobart was also lost. Decision was made to transport the saved mail to New Zealand, and it arrived there in Auckland on the 22nd of May and took the overnight train down to Wellington, where a special receiving cancel was applied to the back of the envelopes. And this Wellington receiving cancel is considered to be the gold standard for mail from the flight. If this does not appear on the cover was not flown on that ill-fated flight. Here are some examples of some of the saved mail. This is from the 2 mail bags from Melbourne. One was sent to Christchurch, and a second is from the second mail bag addressed to Dunedin. Both of these covers have the 7-pence stamps on them, which is the one-way airmail rate. Just to draw to your attention, the blue stamp and these 2 stamps, those are the Australian 1935 Silver Jubilee stamps, which were issued on the 2nd of May. These 2 covers show the return Tasman airmail rate, which was set at 14 pennies or 1 shilling and 2pence. There again was another first for this particular flight and arrangement. Australia required that for all covers originating in Australian cities, they had to have Australian stamps for the Australian-New Zealand leg. However, for the return flight, stamps from either country were valid. Concurrently, New Zealand came up with a similar arrangement, although they indicated that stamps from either country could be valid for flights both way. So the cover on the left here shows the Silver Jubilee stamps with the Australian cancellations on them, and below we have the New Zealand airmail stamps with the Wellington receiving cancel also cancelling these. This cover, by the way, does have the receiving cancel on the back. This is a similar cover, although this time all of the stamps were in Australian currency, and again 1 shilling and 2pence. So this was again another first. There are a couple more examples of some of the rates. For an additional 3pence, you could have your cover flown internally by airmail within Australia, i.e. you could fly from Brisbane to Sydney, and then from Sydney to New Zealand. This particular cover here is a boomerang cover, all airmail both ways, and it is only one of 36 such covers that were sent airmail from Brisbane. It has the added plus of having the signatures of the 3 crew members. Here you can see is Kingsford-Smith, Taylor, and Bob Stanage. Here's another example with a slightly different usage of the stamps. This time this was for a registered mail. Registered postage cost an additional 3pence. So here we have a rate of actually 11pence, which is overpaid by 1 penny, but for 10pence you could send your cover by air and registered mail. And again, there are more signatures of Stanage and Taylor. One of the more exciting discoveries in the last couple of years was the finding of this and the subsequent form letters, which I'm going to show you. Unfortunately, in 1959, the postal archives in New Zealand were lost in a huge fire at the Hope Building, and much of the information was not available. This cover, which is sent on behalf of the Director General and signed by his deputy, F.J. Shanks, was addressed to the postmaster at Wao, which is a little town just north of Christchurch. And this cover, as you can see at the bottom, was provided to me courtesy of Alan Tunnicliffe of Christchurch. Essentially what this letter says is that the enclosed envelope or cover was carried on the Southern Cross. It is probably going to be of some value to the collector, and it is suggested that you arrange some form of special delivery to the recipient. In this case, Mr. Dunbar was the only recipient of a cover in Wao, so he received this form letter which had been addressed to the postmaster. Obviously, that kind of arrangement could not apply in larger cities such as Wellington. And this is a cover which was sent to Mr. Hughes in Wellington. It was enclosed in the OHMS envelope, which was dated 27th of May. And the actual envelope addressed to Mr. Hughes had the Wellington receiving cancel. Enclosed together with the cover was this form letter from Mr. J.M. McLean, who was the chief postmaster in Wellington, just acknowledging that this cover had been saved from the Southern Cross flight. These are extremely rare items. The first form letter to the postmaster in Wao is the only one I've ever seen, and this particular letter from Mr. McLean is only one of form letters. So far, we've dealt with mail that was sent from Australia to New Zealand. However, obviously there was a lot of mail that was left in New Zealand waiting to be carried on the return flight, and this was obviously not going to happen. But the New Zealand authorities, as was their usual policy, decided to arrange for these mail items to be sent to Australia by ship, and 2 ships departed. One from Wellington carrying 2,000 items, and the SS Monterey left Auckland the same day carrying an additional 11,000 items. So between the two, 13,000 items were transported to Australia, both arriving in Sydney on the 20th of May. And most of the covers that arrived received the special receiving cancel. However, as I indicated, not all of the covers received it, and those covers that were going to be flown onward by either internal airmail or out of country airmail did not receive this special cancel. And they said it can be sometimes a little tricky trying to identify whether these covers were part of the original New Zealand return mail. So again, here are some examples. On the left-hand side is a one-way airmail cover from New Zealand to Australia at the 7-penny rate, and the bottom right-hand corner is a cover sent airmail to New Zealand and then returned back by ship to New Zealand at the surface rate of 2p, which was the Australian surface rate. Again, just for your information, these 4 stamps here are the New Zealand 1935 Silver Jubilee stamps. I indicated right near the beginning, New Zealand Post decided to get into the action because of the fact that this would be the first all-air flight between New Zealand and England. And this is an example of a cover flown one way at a rate of 2 shillings and 1 penny, 1 and 6p for the Australia-England rate, and 7p for the Trans-Tasman flight. In addition to this, there was a special arrangement which appears to be, again, a first. I'm trying to confirm this, but for an additional 2p added to the one-way rate, and if you addressed the letter to the New Zealand High Commissioner in London and included your return address, this particular covers would be then returned back to the sender. Before I go into a bit more detail here, I just want to bring to your attention these 5 stamps on the outside of periphery. These are the New Zealand pictorial issues which were issued on the 1st of May. One of the great misfortunes regarding the stamps that were covers that were flown to Britain is the fact that most of them do not have any receiving cancels. We do know that these covers were carried on flight I-341, which departed Brisbane on the 22nd of May and arrived at Croydon Airport on the 3rd of June. But beyond that, we have no other identification. And there was a similar problem with the return of the mail back to New Zealand from the High Commissioner's office. Part of this reason may have been that it appears, as you will notice, there are no British postmarks on this cover on the right-hand side here. It would appear, and it is presumption, that these covers were all placed in a special bag, transported by ship to New Zealand via Australia. There are a couple of covers that do have receiving cancels, and those are dated between the 5th and the 7th of August. So the time frame from arrival in Britain on the 3rd of June and the 5th of August is about 9 weeks, a very long time. I indicated these were probably traveled via Sydney because of the arrival dates, which did not conform to any ships arriving from Canada, which was the usual routing of British mail to New Zealand and Australia. I included this cover just to show you that not all the covers were those special souvenir covers. This is a cover that was sent to India, mailed from Christchurch at the correct rate. And as you can see, it was redirected to Kodaikanal. This is another example of an airmail out of country, this time sent to Japan. And in the top left-hand corner, you can see a JUSCA marking. Like the India cover, it was mailed at the correct rate. And because of the fact that there was no all-air route between Australia and Japan in 1935, this cover was then transported by sea from Singapore to Japan. There's a significant amount of material that just does not really fit into either of these two broad classifications I've used. And so I just labeled this group the mail that never was, for want of a better word. The first thing I wanted to cover was the lost mail that was lost on the flight from Australia to New Zealand. And the different approaches taken by the two postal authorities. There was the hope initially that the registered mail would be reimbursed by Australia Post because many of these covers apparently carried either high value stamps or, like this one, had many stamps on it. The total amount that was expected to be reimbursed would be somewhere in the region of about £2,000 to £3,000, which is about 150 to 220,000 pounds in current day currency. And Australia Post balked at that idea and refused to pay out, citing UPU regulations, which stated that if mail was lost due to circumstances beyond the post office's control, they were not obliged to pay out. So that's what the Australians did, and nobody received any reimbursement or compensation for their mail that was lost. New Zealand authorities and Post took a slightly different tack. As per their usual policy, they allowed mail to be delivered. However, they did indicate that if any returned mail was returned into New Zealand Post, they would in fact reimburse the recipient the face value of the stamps. Just to refresh your memory, there were about 13,000 mail items that left from New Zealand to Australia. It's a significant amount. It is interesting that it is very difficult, when I say very difficult, it's much more difficult to find stamps that were returned back to New Zealand than to find stamps that were sent to either Australia or to England. So one assumes that a fair number of people did in fact take advantage of this offer and turn their covers in. Ernest Crone is probably well known to many of you, a famous air philatelist, particularly during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And Crone had a wonderful way of operating. He befriended many of the airmen and pilots in Australia. And what he arranged to do was for them to carry covers which he had cancelled, usually at the surface rate, at his local post office in Sydney. There are two post offices, close to where he lived and worked. One was at Enmore, and the second one I'll show you in a minute was in Newton. And Crome would arrange for pilots to carry these first flight covers and have the crew sign these covers as well. So this is a cover which Crome arranged to be flown on the Southern Cross, and these are not considered to be part and were not counted in that 28,279 covers of a mail. So these are per favor covers, and I'm sure somebody's going to ask me, what is this 1 penny stamp here in the bottom? I assume that because of the fact that there was a 1 penny return surface mail back to Australia, that Crome applied this penny stamp to this cover and was hoping to have it then mailed back to him in Sydney. The back of this cover is just a brief description signed by Jack Percival, who was the flight manager, indicating that this cover had been carried by the crew on the Southern Cross. Crome must have had a wonderful instinct for mail. This is a cover, there's only 25 of them, which contains all the signatures of the Australian side of the operations, excluding Kingsford-Smith. And this was to be initially carried on the Faith of Australia, which was to be the second plane. However, as I indicated, it did not fly, but when Kingsford-Smith radioed his distress signal, the plane took off to try and find him. Never found him, but this has been labeled as a relief flight. And as I said, Crome has obviously got a wonderful sense of timing. The cover, the stamp rather, is cancelled at Newton, and the date is the 15th of May. It is also believed that the typewritten note on the top indicating this was part of the relief flight was probably done after the relief flight occurred. So now we've dealt with the bulk of the mail, but there's also some mail that obviously didn't quite make it or too late. And this is an example of a cover mailed Melbourne on the 14th of May, traveled overnight by train to Sydney, arriving there at 11 o'clock in the morning, well after the Southern Cross had departed. The Australian authorities applied 2 mauve-coloured cachets to them, and there must have been a significant number of covers that arrived late for them to actually make these cachets. The first one, which is this one over here, indicates received too late for Jubilee Airmail, and the second one states delivered as addressed by ordinary mail. Because this cover was addressed to a local address in Victoria, I suspect that this cover never left Australia. The next little question arose is, what about the New Zealand mail? So very recently I came across this newspaper clipping from the Northern Advocate, which is a newspaper in the northern part of the North Island, where they indicated that postings that were to be made in Australia may be sent undercover postage pay to Sydney Post Office. And again, making the point that it could be prepaid in either New Zealand or Australian stamps. So this would indicate probably that the covers that or envelopes that were sent to us Australia by ship were probably enclosed in a second envelope and went individually and not as a bag. And this would explain the reason for this particular cover, which missed the sailing of May the 9th, as there is no New Zealand cancel on the front, suggesting it was probably inside another envelope. We have the Sydney Post Office cancel or postmark of the 20th of May, which is the date that the both ships arrived in Sydney. And again, we have the 2 mauve cachets as indicated. And someone who I assume to be the postmaster in Sydney has obliterated or signed off the 2 New Zealand stamps. And at the back of this cover is a Green Meadows receiving cancel the 28th of May. In my 10 years of collecting Tasman mail, this is the only cover that I've seen like this. There was some a few letters to the editor indicating there may have been a couple of more from 1935, but as I said, this is the only one that I've seen in 10 years of collecting. The last point I want to cover here is the issue of the myths regarding some of the mail. As I stated a little earlier, there were 7 mailbags that arrived late on the 14th of May, and Walker, who had written the book on New Zealand airmails, and a number of other authors indicated that the 7 late mailbags that arrived on the 14th of May were the ones that were saved. This table here is the data from the Brisbane Mail Office, and as you can see, mail was sent from Brisbane to Sydney on 2 dates. The first was sent by ordinary mail, which arrived before 9 o'clock on the 11th of May and arrived the following morning in Sydney. The mauve, blue, and brown colored numbers are the mail bags that survived from the flight. So obviously here are 2 mail bags which arrived in Sydney on the 12th of May, well before the 14th. Similarly, late mail, which was particularly mail which was going to be flown airmail, which arrived before the 7 a.m. on the 13th of May, they would have been carried on the 8 o'clock flight between Brisbane and Sydney, about a 5-hour flight. So certainly these 3 mail bags arrived well before the 14th of May, and I think effectively debunks the myth that the same mail bags were the ones that were found on the, were the ones that arrived late. The net result of all of this was obviously that Kingsford-Smith's dream effectively ended, and he recognized this to some extent. He started off by firstly selling the Southern Cross to the Australian government. It was affectionately known as the old bus, and he wanted to save it for posterity. And on the 18th of July, he and 6 others climbed on the Southern Cross and took the short flight from Mascot Airport to Richmond Air Force Base. This particular cover has the 7 signatures on it. And as you can see, it's addressed to Ernest Crome, who, interestingly enough, designed this special airmail label for that flight. And again, here we have the 2-penny internal mail surface mail stamp. There is in the bottom right-hand corner here a number. There is no data at all as to how many covers were actually carried on this flight, neither from Eustace or from Crome. The highest number that I've actually seen is 123. Kingsford-Smith still hoped to some way or another to obtain the contract and approach both the Australian and New Zealand governments later in July, but by next month, the New Zealand government had decided to put everything on hold. And then in November of 1935, Kingsford-Smith disappeared on a flight off the coast of Burma on his way from Australia to England, from England to Australia, should I say rather, more importantly. And this effectively was the end of his role and opened the way for Imperial Airways to actually obtain that final leg, which actually only occurred in 1940. Despite the unfortunate ending to Kingsford-Smith, there were a number of interesting philatelic firsts, and just to summarize them again, the first sale of New Zealand stamps at Foreign Post Office, and the first prepayment of return mail from Australia to New Zealand. I'm going to stop there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Back to you, Mark.
Yes, thank you, Neil. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, thank you very much.
I will do that. Thank you. How's that?
Smashing. Thank you so much. Right. Richard, shall we proceed to questions?
Yes, certainly.
Right, you are.
May I just firstly say what a superb and fascinating presentation that was about a remarkable occurrence and the history of the mail. I'll say no more at this stage because I don't want to steal Peter's thunder when he presents a vote of thanks. So we'll move at this moment now to questions. And back to you, Mark, because you will be handling those. But very many thanks, Neil, for that.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Okay. Yes, Neil, we do have a few questions. I think the first one comes from Patrick Reed. Patrick was asking about the postage rates.
Discrepancy.
And a small discrepancy in as much as the threepenny airmail cost in Australia was supplementary to the ordinary postage. I think that was kind of
That is correct.
Yeah, that was kind of clarification that Patrick was seeking there. Yeah, yeah.
So I can just add to that, Mark. The original cost starting in Australia was actually 5p for the Trans-Tasman Airmail route, plus the 2p for the surface rate, which gave you the 7p rate. And it was decided in New Zealand to use the same rate back. So that's how they arrived at the 7p. And as you correctly indicated, the 3p is the additional internal airmail rate in addition to the surface mail rate. So if you flew a cover in Australia, it would cost you 5p.
Okay, thank you. Peter Coburn asks, what proportion of the mail was commercial as opposed to being philatelic?
We have absolutely no idea. I have absolutely no idea. And what I have seen through what I've got, it appears to be most of it was philatelic in the sense that the souvenir covers were used. There were very few covers that I've actually seen that were addressed to commercial people. I do have one example of a letter which was addressed to the New Zealand High Commission office, but to the dairy section, and a second one to a bank. But I suspect that the amount of commercial mail was probably quite low. Or if it was commercial mail, I certainly have not seen it.
Okay, thank you. Nick Hervey asks the following question. He asks, where were the per favour covers carried? Were they carried separately from the mail bags, perhaps with the pilots?
Yes, they were actually, from what I can gather, that they were actually given to the crew and carried by the crew. That was the common practice that Kingsford-Smith Chrome used for his per favour covers. So these were actually handed to the crew probably on the 14th of May or the 13th of May or 14th of May, and then carried. So they were not in any mail bags at all.
Okay, thank you. With regard to the mail that was jettisoned, Michael Seffi asks, did none of the bags that were jettisoned ever float ashore somewhere?
No, nothing was ever found. There was a couple of articles about that, and I think the mail bags themselves are apparently quite heavy and were not necessarily waterproof from what I can understand. And it's presumed that they were heavy enough to sink, so none of that mail has ever been found.
Okay, thank you. Someone that you probably know, I think, Mr. Ingo Nessel, asks, the last cover shows his signature, Scrimgur. Is that any relation to Gray?
I asked the same question. No, that Scrimger is actually a friend of Kingsford-Smith. He's a New Zealander. He was actually a minister, a pastor. Was very active in New Zealand politics, but and I spoke to Gray Scrimger from Victoria. He indicated he did not know this man, but it is an unusual name. But as I said, he was a personal friend of Kingsford-Smith. Okay,
thank you. Grace Davies just would like to ask about the disappearance of Kingsford-Smith. Was his body ever found?
No. So the story is that he was flying with Tommy Petherbridge from England to Australia, and his plane disappeared off the coast of Burma. The only thing that has been found has been a wheel from the plane, and apparently one of the islands just off the coast of Burma, some damage was noted to the top of one of the mountains, and it has been suggested that they were probably flying too low and crashed into the mountain, with the plane subsequently crashing into the sea. I can't remember exactly where the wheel of the Lady Southern Cross, I think it was found. But neither his nor Pethybridge's remains have been found. And similarly, just from a historical perspective, the other major Australian aviator, Charles Kingsford-Smith, was attempting a trans-Pacific flight early in 1935, and his plane went down as well, and his remains have not been found either. So both of the two first pioneers of the Trans-Tasman Trans-Pacific flight have been lost, and their bodies never recovered.
Okay, thank you. On the subject of Kingsford-Smith's flights, Derek Lambert asks, do you have any knowledge of a Kingsford-Smith flight when he landed near Burnley in the north of England in 1933?
Not offhand. I do have a couple of books about Kingsford-Smith that, and I suspect if I go back through those, I will be able to find them. There's one little thing which I excluded from the talk, which I think is just useful, what I call footnotes, and that is the name of the plane. Most people have believed that the name of the plane, Southern Cross, relates to the stars. However, Kingsford-Smith, when he was a young boy, lived with his parents in Vancouver in British Columbia, and there's actually a school named after him there. And in 1906, his father and older brother were involved in creating the first, the word escapes me now. Oh, just give me a second here. It's funny, I guess we're all getting old, and you sometimes forget few things.
Been there.
And well, anyway, he oh, sorry, just give me 1 minute here, and I will give you that information. But I think it is quite interesting. It was a Masonic lodge. It was formed in Vancouver by Australians, and the Masonic lodge was named Lodge Southern Cross. And Kingsford-Smith was actually a very strong lodge member, Masonic lodge member for his entire life. And it is believed, and there are a number of articles to this thing, that in fact the name Southern Cross for that plane came from the name of the lodge, Masonic Lodge Southern Cross. So that is just, again, a small little footnote with regarding to the name of the plane. And apologies for my slip in memory there.
That's okay, thank you very much. Now, from my observation, that was the final question. So I would say that we've completed the Q&A session, and I would like to hand back to Richard, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. It's now my great pleasure to invite Peter Newroth. Not only is he a fellow of the Society, he's also one of our representatives in Canada. And it's, as I say, it's my pleasure to ask him if he would present the vote of thanks on behalf of everybody attending this meeting this afternoon. So over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Unmute, Peter.
Good morning or good afternoon. My fellow philatelists, it's a great pleasure to thank Neil Donen on behalf of our participants today and on behalf of the Royal Philatelic Society London. This was an excellent presentation, and it had very fine material with a great amount of interest and personality, I would say. Neil's organization was superb, and he supported it with all sorts of research that has taken him, as he acknowledged, 10 years of collecting to assemble. So his story gives us a glimpse of how difficult and critical events were in this time of 86 years ago, and how the flight fits into the development of the new and growing civil aviation of this globe and the airmail service that related to it. As you probably know from the introductory notes, Neil is a specialist in the Silver Jubilee issues in 1935. And he has exhibited those stamps in his previous years. And this exhibit that he has shown you, or this display that he has shown you, is actually entered now in a competitive exhibit virtually at PIPEX 2021. And you can look at the one frame exhibit that he has entered at pipexstampshow.org. So I noted the results of the competition will not be available until May 8th, so that's a few days away from now. So I would like to close by saying that Neil has been a great friend of mine for about 20 years, and he and his family and my family have shared many adventures and travels. This has been yet another fun philatelic event, and I'd like to thank the Royal, Richard, and others for the opportunity to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. I'm much obliged to you for that vote of thanks. As far as crash mail and recovered mail is concerned, it's something that I have a particular interest in. One area, the East African route, because although first flights aren't considered by many people, the important part about them is that frequently something happened on that flight which the sender of the envelope could not have known about at the time that it was posted. And it puts those items into a completely different category. And we have seen a wonderful series of examples of that this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed, Neil. We now move to the question of the certificate. And Mark, I think you have the electronic version available.
Yes, I do. Yes.
We present all our displayers with a certificate. We show you the electronic one, as this is a totally virtual presentation at this stage, but you will receive the hard copy through the post, as I say to everyone, in due course. Congratulations, Neil, and thank you very much indeed for this presentation this afternoon.
Thank you. It has been my honor and my pleasure, and I've really enjoyed this. And again, I really have to thank both Mark and Richard for their assistance in helping me make this run so smoothly. So thank you very much, and greetings to all from beautiful British Columbia.
Thank you. I think that brings us, Mark, to the end of the presentation and this afternoon's official event. So you will no doubt wish to stop recording.